Hello, everyone. Welcome to another YouTube broadcast. We are really thrilled to be joined by two prominent education reformers in the country, people that I think a lot of movement shakers and movers look to if you support school choice or just having educational reform. And I'm speaking with the co-authors of Mediocrity, 40 Ways Government Schools Are Failing Today's Students, with Connor Boyack and Corey DeAngelis. You may know their names. They do a lot in their respective kind of educational circles. And we're going to talk about the book and where the status of education is today. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Why don't you briefly talk about your backgrounds and what led you both to be involved in education reform and the subsequent movement?
Go ahead, Corey.
Yeah, cool. So I actually started all of this as a researcher at the University of Arkansas, where I did my PhD in education policy. And my first study linked the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, their private school choice program that started in about 1990, to criminal activity later on in life. And my co-author, Patrick Wolf, and I found that being able to use that program and have more educational opportunities was associated with large reductions in the likelihood of crime and paternity disputes later on in life, which kind of thrust me into the national conversation. I started to figure out pretty quickly that the peers in the peer review process were not my peers, they were my enemies. And so I decided to go to the think tank route. But I also attended government schools, all K through 12 in San Antonio, Texas. But in high school, I had the opportunity to go to a magnet school, which is still technically run by the government, still a district school, but it doesn't have as much monopoly power in the sense that you're not residentially assigned to a magnet school. You can choose it, and they can have their admissions processes and standards, and they can have specialized missions as well. So that had a big positive impact on my life, and I think more families should have access to educational options, but it shouldn't be limited to options that are run by the government. You should be able to choose public, private, charter, or home-based education options, and the money should follow the student because the money is meant for educating the child, not for protecting a particular institution, whether it's public or private.
You know, Corey is so good that even in just a biography about himself, he gets in all the right talking points at the end. So he's done this a few times. So my background, I run Libertas Institute. It's a think tank in Utah. We now work across the country. My background is more in political activism and writing. I too am a graduate of what I like to call the public fool system. And I had a negative experience. There were a lot of things I didn't love. And so I've spent a lot of time researching and learning what went wrong, what's going wrong, so that I could spare my kids the same fate that I experienced. And so education reform is a big area of focus for Libertas Institute. As Corey knows, Utah became the fourth state across the country to pass an ESA, education spending account law, to try and unlock some of this money to go towards education alternatives. And so it's a big passion of mine because I don't think we're going to save our country at the Capitol. I don't think we're going to save our country at the courtroom. If our country is to be saved, I think it's at the dinner table where families together are debating real world ideas, developing critical thinking. So we need an education system that supports that enhances it. And that's what Corey and I are fighting for.
It shouldn't be a surprise that a lot of us, and I talked with Corey about this in a previous conversation, I also graduated from public schooling, K through college. And I think a lot of us who went through public schooling saw a lot of shortcomings, even if we went to very affluent school districts and had good opportunities, there were still very vast shortcomings. So I don't think you guys are alone. And I think there are many others who similarly went through the kind of schooling system we went through. And you both tied the book's release to a very important anniversary that hasn't really been discussed. It was 40 years, and you both can talk more about the report, but it was on 40 years of a very prescient kind of report illuminating the fact that mediocrity has kind of taken over schools. And you point to the premise of your book is to say it wasn't just the COVID pandemic that gave a light to mediocrity in schools. This has unfortunately been a long-standing problem, even tracing back to this report from 40 years ago. So could you both tie back to why you included this report, why it's so significant as a theme throughout your book?
Yeah, well, it was really great timing. It coincided with the 40th anniversary of the famous Nation at Risk report that was released April 26th, 1983, that warned of a rising tide of mediocrity in the government school system. Well, here we are 40 years later, and we still have a lot of the same problems. And some people would argue that things have gotten worse in some ways, especially when you look at things that aren't captured by standardized test scores. Kids being indoctrinated in the schools, secrets being kept from parents. Perhaps that was happening a long time ago too, but now it's much more obvious. It's right in front of everybody for everyone to see. Just look at the Libs of TikTok Twitter account. You can see a lot of the crazy individuals that are indoctrinating kids in the schools. And some families might be okay with the public school system. And like I always like to say, if you like your public school, you can keep your public school. Unlike with your doctor, when you have school choice initiatives, for real this time, you can actually keep it. You can have that option on the table. But yeah, so it was great timing for the release of our book, and we really had to whittle down the examples of failures of the government school system. We really wanted just to keep it down to 40. We had several hundreds of examples of ways that the school system was failing students, but we made sure to just keep it as short as possible, 40 examples. And it also coincided with the day that Randi Weingarten was testifying before Congress, gaslighting in front of the entire world about how actually she was fighting to reopen schools, which is an example in our book about how the school system is a massive failure, largely because the government school system is influenced by powerful union bosses like Randi Weingarten and Becky Pringle from the AFT and the NEA.
One thing to add before we move past this 40th anniversary, Gabriella, is that part of the report that Corey was talking about said that again, 1983, they said this, that if a foreign government had attempted to impose upon America the very mediocre educational performance we now have, again, they said that in 1983, we might have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we've allowed this to happen to ourselves. And so these very stark terms to realize, we've slid into mediocrity. We would have hated for someone else to push this upon us. We've invited it upon ourselves. And as the kind of slide towards mediocrity or sub-mediocrity has continued in the 4 decades since, it's alarming, especially as Corey points out, so much of what's important in education, you can't measure on a standardized test, but you can at least compare from kind of a peer-to-peer basis. And among America's top 10 economic contenders, different countries across the world, our country ranks lowest. We are at the bottom for educational attainment. And so it should be a huge warning for what is the future of our country going to be and our place on the world stage and the economic opportunities for our kids. The dire language used in 1983 was, I think, used for a reason to try and wake parents up. And so we've employed some similar language in our own book to say, parents, this is a call to arms. You got to do something different if you want different results.
That's very true. And I think you both gave a great history lesson. I found this to be very important in the context of your book, that these ideas just didn't come out of nowhere. They didn't spring about just randomly. You cite two progressive reformers, so to speak, or two progressive educational kind of godfathers, intellectual godfathers of mediocrity, in your words, who popularized standardized testing, made everything very mechanized and impersonal. So you spoke at length about Horace Mann and John Dewey. Could you speak briefly, each of you, to both of those individuals and what they did and how their musings kind of catalyzed and grew into what we see today, manifested in public schooling?
Yeah, this is the whole notion of the factory model school. And John Taylor Gatto wrote extensively about this in a couple of books. I wish he were still with us today. He unfortunately passed away a few years ago. But Horace Mann went over, he was the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts. And he went over he went over to, this is the state that had the first compulsory education law. And he went over to Prussia, which is modern day Germany, to examine their school system. And, their compulsory education law started with the express purpose of creating obedient soldiers for the army and obedient factory workers as well. And we see a lot of remnants of that in the government school system that we have here today. And even if it's not the express purpose today, we still have the same system that was built a long time ago. And you still kind of see how you have to raise your hand to do anything. It's a lot of the things that we do in school is more about obedience than actual academic excellence.
John Dewey is interesting because though he came after Horace Mann, he was cut from the same philosophical cloth. These guys were secular humanists. They were social reformers, first and foremost. They wanted to shape society, which meant they had to divorce the parents from their kids and be able to have control, which is why Horace Mann kind of innovated in America the compulsory schooling laws, which now are endemic to the whole country. And John Dewey was such a fan. He has a book called My Pedagogic Creed, and there and elsewhere in his writings, he talks about how in his mind, teachers are the prophets of the one true God. They're kind of the emissaries and the ambassadors. Well, he didn't believe in God. He was an atheist. His God was literally government. And so profits were kind of the emissaries of the government to shape the rising generation to support the state. And so when people tell me, when I'm out speaking, and a parent will say like, oh, but critical race theory and social emotional learning and, books in libraries and all these problems, the school system is broken. I pause and I say, I respectfully disagree, because if you look at the early architects of this very system we now have today, what we're experiencing is an outgrowth of the very things that they wanted to accomplish. And so if you want different results, you have to question how the system is designed. Even if you set aside all the social engineering aspects, which the early architects were very big proponents of and intentional about, set that aside and focus on, as Corey mentioned, preparing people to be factory workers. The school model today, just from an economic lens, continues to prepare kids for an economy that hasn't existed in nearly a century. And so just from an economic standpoint, if nothing else, these institutions are antiquated. They're not innovative, in large part, as Corey and I contend in the book, because they have not really faced any substantial competitive pressures to excel and innovate, which is the whole, the root Henry David Thoreau talks about. For every 1,000 striking at the branches of evil, there's one striking at the root. And the root of education is this pseudo monopoly that the system has. We need to unlock that. We need to have education entrepreneurship, diversity of options and opportunities that best speak to each individual child. Then we're going to see performance improve and cost decline.
And I mean, you've also seen this throughout history in the American school system, where people have pointed out that they want the public school system for a more cohesive democratic society. And the question is always, well, what does that look like, and who gets to decide what a great American citizen looks like and what type of person that should be? I mean, we're seeing that today too, and COVID kind of opened the eyes of so many families that a lot of the teachers, for better or for worse, well, it's for worse, are trying to shape kids in ways that are aligned with their values, not necessarily the parents' values. So now we have this huge conflict over the past few years where we've seen this basically a tug of war between the government school system and those in charge versus the parents trying to get a hold of their kids back. A lot of them, thankfully, are homeschooling their kids now. The Census Bureau indicated that there's been roughly a doubling of homeschooling relative to pre-pandemic levels. I'm not sure how much of that has remained since we don't have updated data. But the good news is parents are flocking this system. They want to raise their kids in ways that are aligned with their own values. They're homeschooling. They're doing micro schools and what we called pandemic pods through the pandemic period, where 5 to 10 children were getting together in a household to outsource or economize on the process of homeschooling. And school choice initiatives are just blossoming in red states all across the country as well.
You guys listed obviously 40 key examples. It's probably was very hard and very daunting task to narrow down to 40 examples, but you alluded to the, I would say, influence and rather kind of power of public sector teachers unions, who have actually been pretty meddlesome for a long time. I remember, Corey, when I spoke with you last, I mentioned how I saw them at 6 years old protesting, even though they were working in a very affluent area. They were paid higher than most teachers, largely because California is a non-right to work state. So they can obviously be very influential and demand these rates and tenure and what have you. It doesn't matter how they perform. But obviously the book's release, interestingly enough, coincided with that House subcommittee hearing. Do you guys want to comment about that and how you kind of highlighted that in the book and anything else that Randi Weingarter added from her musings and how that relates to your chapter on her and similar acolytes like her?
Yeah, look, her union lobbied the CDC to make it more difficult to reopen schools. We knew this before the hearing, and it just became even more clear during the hearing. She had the direct phone number of Rochelle Walensky, the CDC director. The CDC wasn't following the science. They were following the political science. And her union spiked their donations to Congress, primarily to Democrats, while they were debating about reopening schools. Her union threatened safety strikes in the summer of 2020. She called Trump's plan to reopen schools in the summer of 2020 cruel and callous, and she fear-mongered nonstop. She had her local affiliates, the Chicago Teachers Union, deleting tweets saying that the push to reopen schools is rooted in sexism, racism, and misogyny. They were throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick so that they can prevent their members from going back to work. And that didn't make sense to a lot of parents over the pandemic period until people started to realize that this is a teachers union, not a kids union. And the problem with public sector unions in particular is that they're basically lobbying against, they're pushing for policies against the public, and they get to bargain with people across the table that they essentially elect. Look at what happened in Chicago with the mayor's race. They poured tons of money into that race using taxpayer dollars, basically, to get elected one of their friends. Whereas in the private sector, if you're dealing with the manager has their own priorities, and the union would have their own priorities, and the customer wouldn't get the short end of the stick. But like we've seen with the school closures, the families got the short end of the stick when the teachers go on strike. There's no there's no feedback mechanism that makes its way to the district in the government school system or the employer, because the families are the ones that get stuck feeling all the pain. They don't have any exit options. The money still goes to the district. The employer doesn't have an incentive to change things. And that's the problem with public sector unions. Connor and I don't have problems, I don't think. Connor, you correct me if I'm wrong, with private sector unions, where there's incentives for them to push for things that are okay. And if they don't, then they would be damaged as a result.
Yeah, and I echoing what Corey said, that they're really a teachers union and not a kids union. I think more to the point, to even add an exclamation point to what he was saying there, is that the kids are used as political props by the teachers unions. Everything is in the name of the children. Think of the children. We're doing this for our students, when in reality, this has turned into a jobs program for adults. And we've seen just in the past couple of days some tweets about this, where some teachers unions are admitting that it's about, the teachers and what we want and what we need. But it's rare that they will be open about that, because they know that if they are transparent about them trying to reap benefits, financial and otherwise, for themselves, they'll come across as just a traditional union trying to flex political power. And so everything is in the name of the kids, because how dare you try and harm the children? We're out there looking out for them, when in reality they're not. And if anything, it becomes this adversarial relationship where the parents are treated as so-called domestic terrorists by those in political power, and treated as adversaries, where their voice is minimized, if not excluded. And that's something that the teachers union thrives on, because they want to be the preeminent experts in that domain, and that requires excluding their competitors, which are the very parents of the students that they purportedly exist to be teaching and supporting.
And one piece of good news, if anybody's following all of this mess on Twitter, where Randy keeps trying to continue the gaslighting, saying, oh, we really tried to reopen. I mean, one, no one believes that. But two, if they were really trying that hard, then why weren't they open? Why was Chicago public school still closed because of strikes in 2022? I mean, 2 weeks to slow the spread turned into 2 years to flatten a generation of kids. And at the very least, they were extremely incompetent that they couldn't get the schools back open. The private schools were open from the get-go. Private grocery stores were open, and other businesses. You had the public sector teachers union board members from Chicago vacationing in Puerto Rico in person while railing against going back to work in person. You had a Berkeley teachers union president railing against going back to work in person by sending his own kid to in-person private school. I mean, it was just it was just so much never-ending hypocrisy that it's obvious for anybody watching all this. But on Twitter, Randy's been trying to put some pinned tweets up of some of her testimony or some of her news interviews, and just continuing we tried to open schools since April of 2020. We were trying our best. We really were. And then she closes her replies like she closed the schools. But Twitter, thank goodness for Elon Musk, hit back pretty hard with the community note fact check, pointing out that she opposed reopening schools every step of the way, or at least changed or moved the reopening goalposts every step of the way. And in order to try to get away from the community notes, she changed her pinned tweet 2 other times in 3 days. And she got fact checked 3 times each day for 3 days in a row. And it was absolutely glorious to watch unfold.
Yeah. And she always tries to tussle with you and any other school reformer. It's really funny. And even though I don't typically handle the education portfolio, I still watch it. I have a lot of colleagues that focus on education, and you see how egregious her tweets are. It's extremely laughable. There's well-documented proof of her stating that we need to close this, the FOIA request, obviously, to the 2021 report of her colluding with the CDC to keep schools continually, perpetually closed. And that is why both of you have talked about the Parents Matter movement coming about. It helped to shape Virginia's gubernatorial election. It's shaping other type of election, school choice, coming about. And I know there's been some criticism of people saying, some who purport to be conservatives or school reformers who say, well, we can't have reforms, that the school system's irredeemable. We can't pursue school choice because it won't matter in the end because these institutions have been captured. And how would you both respond to that? Because that to me is a defeatist attitude. And that doesn't mean that school choice is going to be the end all be all. It's a great solution, especially in states like the Commonwealth of Virginia, where our options are very sparse, and in especially blue states, and even in red states where they are reluctant to pursue these options, but have the available means to do it. But different people may choose, micro schools, or maybe they'll do homeschooling, but it all factors into what you guys call educational entrepreneurship. But how do you respond to people who say that they reject any kind of solution and say that these, institutions are irredeemable? We can't have that attitude, I think, if fix schools, right?
Well, you're right. I mean, it's like the 2-button meme where the guy's looking at the 2 buttons and he doesn't know which one to press and he's sweating because he can't figure it out. It's to illustrate 2 things that are logically incompatible with one another at the same time, and people trying to say both things. So you have this argument that the institutions are irredeemable and the public school system is so horrible and they're indoctrinating kids. And then in the next breath, well, we got to trap those kids in those failing government schools that are irredeemable. No, let's let them out. Let's allow them to have choices. Of course, the alternatives might have problems too, but giving the power to the parents, putting them in the driver's seat, they're more likely to choose less woke schools. Yes, some parents will choose schools with CRT, but who am I to tell a parent what school they ought to have their kids in? You're less likely to get those problems in the private sector, even though it's not a perfect solution. So this is the basic response I have. This is making perfect the enemy of the good. We have 90% of kids in government-run schools today, and they might vote to regulate private and home education tomorrow if they're being indoctrinated in government-run schools to love big government policy. And the reality is the government can already regulate private and home education. And they have. I mean, in 1922 in Oregon, they outlawed private education. You had to go to the government school. Thankfully, in 1925, the Supreme Court in Pierce versus Society of Sisters struck down that bigoted law where the court famously said, the child is not the mere creature of the state. Some people would be wise to remember those wise words from the majority opinion in 1925. But look, in New York City, you have efforts to regulate the Jewish schools because they don't have the test scores that people in the state want. And in homeschooling, they have some of the worst homeschooling laws in the country in New York. You have to have a certain percentile score on their state tests to even have the right to educate your own kids at home. I mean, it's ridiculous. In order to raise your own kids, you have to take the state standardized test and get a certain score. It's absolutely blasphemous that we allow this in the country of America that we live in today. But is that because of a private school choice law in New York? No, they don't have any private school choice laws allowing you to use the funding for homeschooling. It's because there's authoritarians in government that don't know their place and want to control every movement of the rest of society. And so if you actually look at the states that have more school choice, they tend to have better homeschooling laws that protect homeschooling freedom and private education freedom at the same time. And school choice cuts against the likelihood of government overreach and regulation of private education at least 2 ways. 3. 1, it allows for more people to exit the government school system where they'll be less likely to be indoctrinated like big government policies to vote to regulate it later. 2, if more people are using private and home education, you have a bigger coalition, a bigger tent to defend against those future calls for regulations from authoritarians in government or the rest of society. And 3, if more people are using private and home education through school choice mechanisms, the concept becomes more mainstream. If it's more mainstream, the rest of society will be less likely to call to regulate it because it'll be less likely to be viewed as something that's kind of icky that only a few people are doing over here. So more mainstream is good when it comes to a lower likelihood of calls for regulation in the future. And look, all of these programs are voluntary. You don't have to take the funding. There have been school choice programs in the country that have been around since the 1800s, actually, in states like Maine and Vermont. We can talk a little bit about what those how those were structured later, but we've had school choice for decades, for the most part in the country today. And if there was government overreach that resulted from school choice, I think we would have seen it by now. The people making these fear-mongering claims, the burden of proof should be on them. So show me where this has led to government control of private and home education, and show me where there's been a involuntary program that forces you to accept the funding. It's never happened. And if it were to be the case that was proposed, Connor and I would lock arms in fighting against that proposal.
Amen.
Yeah, that was very well stated. I haven't seen any proof of that either. It usually leads to more freedom. And like I think I tweeted and I sent to you that most of the time, I think with parents now awakened to what is happening in schools, I could see them coalescing together, much like people are doing to fight off ESG, which I think ESG is not going to welcome school choice. ESG is largely a progressive ideology stemming from, investment strategy, but it's morphed into a political ideology. I see an extension of anti-school choice behavior exuded through that. So like I said, I haven't seen any corporate board capture of wanting to take over private schools. They have those woke private schools, but parents can choose not to send their kids to that. From my understanding, they're not going to be coerced into doing that. And so, I don't see any proof of that leading to more restriction, more central planning with respect to education. It liberates kids, as we see right now. And that was a good point that you made. But could you both, Connor, could you speak to education entrepreneurship as we round out our conversation? And then I'll have you both direct people to the book as well. But speak to entrepreneurship in the education space if you can.
I'll maybe add a little bit from the last question,
Sure.
Then tie us to education entrepreneurship. So running a think tank and being intimately involved in passing one of these ESA laws in our state very recently, everything that Corey said is on point, and I'll focus it in this way. At any point, anyone in the legislature can file a bill and say, we want to regulate homeschooling, or we want to add all these strings, whether there is a school choice program or not. So if the political appetite exists to do that, it can be done. And there have been attempts. Even in red states like Utah, there have been attempts to try and regulate homeschooling from, the left and people who think that we need to protect the children, because who knows? I mean, you remember Elizabeth Bartholet at Harvard, who was saying that parents need permission slips to educate their own children and all that ridiculous stuff from a couple of years ago. So at any point, any effort can be made, whether there's a school choice program or not. And I think Corey's right. The mere existence of these programs doesn't guarantee or even necessarily suggest that type of regulation will be invited. Parents use, food stamps and WIC and all these things, for their kids and their families. That doesn't mean the government comes in and tells them how to parent their children. At most, it's an audit where, hey, did you fraudulently use money? But there's no oversight and control. Similarly with education, by putting the parents in the driver's seat of how to receive and spend the money, it really minimizes the regulatory nexus. Now, this is a reason I don't really ever like vouchers where the money flows directly to the school, because the nexus for regulation is the school itself. Whereas under this model, the parents are in the driver's seat. They can go spend the money at Amazon field trips or whatever, which leads to education entrepreneurship, because when parents are empowered to be the spenders of the money, all of a sudden people step forward like, oh, wait, I suddenly can go appeal to that market. I can go build a micro school. Teachers leaving the government school system because they're frustrated with all the bureaucracy and regulations, and they can teach fewer children with fewer and zero, frankly, regulations. They can be their own boss. They can be an entrepreneur and make more money than they ever did in the government school system. And so you have all these people stepping forward. Now, I will say a word of caution, and this is something that we're trying to fix in Utah and work on across the country. We gathered in a room a few months ago, all these education entrepreneurs who are starting little micro schools and trying to do stuff. And we said, we want to hear your problems. What are the issues that you're running into? How can we help, address them and clear them out of the way? The biggest one that we ran into consistently was regulatory issues at a local level, like zoning. Like the local governments don't even know how to classify these. Some cities call them childcare daycare centers, which comes with a whole host of crazy regulations and all these things you have to put into your building. Some were saying, oh, you're a school. And so all the regulations designed for a large private school with a campus, these little micro schools of 20 kids we're having to apply with. So we're trying to create a law in Utah, the first in the country, that would identify what these micro schools are and then clear out all the regulations to say, let them go in whatever zone they want. Don't don't add all these crazy parking restrictions or kitchen restrictions and all these things that just create barriers to entry. We want to remove the barriers. We want to allow the education entrepreneurs with very little capital and time to just go get started and serve these kids. A lot of them already are. They're just breaking a whole bunch of laws and they don't have regulatory clarity. And so I think that's one area where, you know, with Corey across the country, with AFC and think tanks like ours, and the State Policy Network, we're trying to create these laws from the demand side almost, to empower parents to say, hey, we demand, you know, education, entrepreneurship, and alternatives for our children. But we also need to fix the supply side, and we need to make sure that the marketplace itself doesn't have these barriers in the way. I see that as a big obstacle in the years ahead, that as all this money starts flooding the system for parents to go spend, you're going to have a lot of entrepreneurs step forward and say, hey, I want to build a school. Oh crap, I have to pay $200,000 to my city just to, you know, get permission to do it. So we want to clear those barriers out of the way. And with that kind of duality of the funding side and also the regulatory side, I think we can knock down a lot of barriers, help a lot of families exit a school system that isn't serving their children, and then open up a competitive marketplace where, yes, like Corey said, if you like your public school, you can keep your public school, but the public schools are going to improve when they know that they have to appeal to the very parents that they want to retain, and they're going to be induced to improve far more than they ever have before.
Yeah, I have four things. I have four more responses to this ridiculous fear-mongering argument. I got to hit it really quickly. And it's tied to what Connor was talking about introducing more supply into the market as a result of putting the parents in the driver's seat and the money following the child. So yes, you might be able to point to a couple of private schools and say, this one's woke, this one's woke. But you're looking at, people who are making this argument are looking at the supply of private education as though it was fixed. You'd have a lot more conservative options sprouting up at the money followed the child, especially because a lot of the parents who are leaving the public school system right now are unhappy with the leftist indoctrination happening in the public schools. Two, if this was really all about the government controlling private education and the left being able to control the public and the private schools, why are all the Democrats voting against it with all these bills across the country? If the Democrats really love all the, school choice as a promotion of equity and controlling private education, they would all be voting for it. When they're not. They almost universally vote against it. And then three, Randy Weingarten, who we talked about earlier, has tweeted these same fear-mongering arguments against school choice. That she's doing that because she's a small government libertarian. No, she's a big government socialist, and she's only repeating these arguments because she knows if they gain traction, she'll be able to block school choice, which threatens her monopoly in blue states and in red states. So she's doing whatever she can to keep her gravy train going. If you're on the side of Randy Weingarten, you're probably on the wrong side. You should be on my side and Connor's side. And look, all school choice bills are not the same. You got to read the bill. A lot of these people making these arguments admit that they hadn't even read the bill. And so a lot of these bills that are the model legislation being pushed all across the country have explicit provisions in them saying that the government can't control the curriculum, creed, admissions processes, and so on of the private school. So that further reduces the likelihood of regulation in the future. So instead of fighting against all school choice bills whatsoever, if you want to make this argument, you should instead direct your efforts towards pushing for amendments to bills. If you have certain problems with them, you should push for an amendment to get rid of X, Y, or Z regulation that you might see in the bill. That's the better path forward.
And while we round out our conversation, where can everyone find Mediocrity? Why don't you guys give the plug, and then how people can connect with you who are watching?
So easiest place is on Amazon. We hit #1 bestseller in our category. We were in top 10 on Amazon for a little while, which was really fun. So launch day was just recently, April 26th, the 40th anniversary of the report that we mentioned at the beginning. So sending everyone to Amazon, where you can search Corey's name or my name, or just type in Mediocrity book and you'll find it there. Where you can find me is connorboyack.com. I'm best known probably for the Tuttle Twins books, so you can check those out at TuttleTwins.com, or our think tank, Libertas Institute, is at libertas.org.
Yeah, you can just Google DeAngelis Boyack Mediocrity. That's the way I find it most frequently. So yeah, make sure you get the book. And then if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at DeAngelis Corey. If you want to look at AFC's work, the American Federation for Children, or even just to help us in the fight for education freedom, you can go to the Education Freedom Pledge, which is just educationfreedompledge.com.
Wonderful. And I obviously wrote about it at Town Hall. I'll include links to that, to all the aforementioned links you both have mentioned. And it's been a pleasure talking to you both. I want to wish you continued success. And any way I could be a resource, please let me know. But I think this movement is catching on, the Parents Matter movement, putting students before systems. A lot of people are catching on, and there will be people who are despondent towards your efforts on both the right and the left. But you guys have something going on, and I think this is a very timely book, and I hope more people read it, going off of our conversation and just looking to your efforts. So thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriella.